Good morning, everybody. I'm Carlos Melconian. Thank you very much to all of you for being connected. And thank you very much, too, for Summit of America's organizers and for inviting me one more time this year in this virtual experience. Well, we talk about what happened in the world, in the region, and specifically in the three different countries, Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. And to see the framework of what happened 2 minutes before and then after the pandemic, we will check under the title, The Triangle of a Crisis 2020-2021, and we will check what happened from the sanitary, political, and economic crisis. For that, we see what happened in the global economy before a little bit and after the pandemic. And we check that from the sanitary side, political side, and economic side. And same as from the regional triangle, the starting point of the crisis and the three impacts. After that, we will focus directly on Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. We'll try to complete this picture in my 45 minutes. So, beginning, we can say the world trend until the pandemic was the difficult to grow. That was the main characteristic, with the intention to move, to up the rate of inflation to more comfortable levels. Until 2020, in fact, the US, the country, had been growing well, but that it would not enough to spill over to the rest of the world. In other words, did not compensate the downturn that it's up with that were happening in other countries and regions, as China and the stagnation in Latin America. So, in other words, the world macro did not find a clear growth factors for the future. So, even more, the financial conditions were coming from a gradual tightening, plus the US-China trade war. The chronic lack of dynamism led to a downward trend in inflation. So the problem was the toolbox of economic policy. That was the problem. So, in other words, the central bankers appeared as in the short of instruments, trying to improve the economy and trying to move to a more comfortable levels, the rate of inflation. My final issue is that the reinterest rates as an instrument have little room to go down. That's my first view and the picture. So we can see a good level of economic growth in the world as a trend, but based especially in USA and the downtown of China. The slowdown of China from the Chinese rates to a more normal rates, the stagnation of Latin America, and that was the idea. So in the middle of that discussion, the pandemic hit. That was the idea. The pandemic set the world in a head political and economic triangle that took 2020, probably 2021, I don't know, and special for your business. So I saw different base scenarios and baseline different scenarios with a more difficult and different kind of difficulties, maybe more, 2022, 2023, nobody knows. From the sanitary point of view, the health crisis, the infection, deaths, vaccines, so far are open-ended. That's my first view. From the political point of view, the issue was that the lack of leadership deepened. So we saw enormous lack of coordination and even more, great regime changes from the political point of view. I mean, different things, different impacts has happened with Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. And from the economic point of view, the collapse on the level of activities, employment, trade, with several and different consequences. So affected the different sectors, high unemployment to the population, and especially astronomical impact on from the fiscal and monetary imbalances. Beginning by one point of the triangle, the sanitary point, there was no unique pandemic management model in the world. Each country moved forward with its own model, and so far none of them was successful. That was the main lesson. Each country had its own particularities. So second waves were not avoided, and today the third wave is developing in some countries, so nobody knows. The vaccines need to be scaled up, distribute, and administer. So at the end of the road, the global effectiveness of the vaccines and the consequence of normalization of activities, so and flows, and people depend on the vaccines reaching homogeneously through the world. That's the idea. So we can add to this factor the uncertainties due to the new strains of the virus. That's our main idea. We can see the picture. We can see that in March, the total of cases and deaths in the northern hemisphere drop again. But one of the main lessons for the region is that after summer in the north hemisphere, so double and even more the cases of infection. So that's the meaning of the second wave for Latin America. Finally, in a percentage of population that is receiving the vaccines, we can check the different groups with a high level of vaccination, low level of vaccination, and the third one. So our three countries under discussion, under speech, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, is clearly under the group number 3, so the group of several with low levels of access to the vaccination. So the global political side of the crisis shows us the pandemic made visible a lack, as I told you, of a leadership worldwide, with several communication deficiencies, even including the World Health Organization, the G20, the G7. The US did not take a leading role on the crisis. In Europe, same Angela Merkel could hardly sustain a limited leadership to the Union, and there was a great distance from the actions of the world leaders and institutions in comparison to what happened with the 2008-2009 Lehman Brothers experience. So far, we are without any type of regional or global parameter of coordination. The political disorder, such political disorder was not innocuous. It conditioned ruling parties and led to surprising electoral defeats. All of countries, USA, Biden, Italy, with Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte resignation, Spain with several problems with the ruling party Podemos, Jair Bolsonaro, so looks very value and the possibility that Lula da Silva could stress again the political arena. The Communist Party candidate in Chile, same in Peru, the appearance of Correa's candidate in Ecuador, Luis Arce in Bolivia, and even Cristina Fernandez in Argentina. So this process is, the vaccination process is a necessary issue, but not sufficient condition that for the ruling party facing election this year, as happened with Mr. Piñera in Chile or Netanyahu in Israel. And finally, from the economic side, the pandemic left the global trend off track, definitely, and leaves a deep output gap from around 6 to 7%. Although in 2021, the world could recover that the world it lost during 2020, it will be 6 to 7%, while it would have been 8 or 9% per capita without a pandemic. It will take several years to close that gap. So, in other words, taking into account that the several countries is returning, rebounding at the V shape, practically covering the total amount of the losses, so the output gap looks higher than the other opportunities. I cannot relate it to the economic pandemic impact to the countries, that it looks with a high geographical heterogeneity. The economic crisis this time did not distinguish between emerging and developing countries. They are a bad and a good performance within the both groups. We can see developed countries and emerging countries within the best performing countries, even decreasing. And we can see developed countries and emerging markets into the worst performing countries. Same heterogeneity by sectors. For example, good producing sectors is in a better position than the service producing sectors. The service sectors, and especially those linked to the tourism, are clear losers of the pandemic. One of my last points, it's related to the negative sequel on the unemployment rate. It's practically except for United States. The pandemic is leaving a higher natural unemployment in all of countries that we study. And the second negative sequel is that the large countries enter into an unexplored fiscal and monetary territory, facing the future the problem related to the primary fiscal deficit, the net debts, and what happened with the central banks. So we can see that the entire world and the four bigger central banks to issue double-digit amounts as a percentage of GDP, almost as a counterpart of a huge fiscal deficit and debt issuance. That is a question mark facing the future, and it's open. My conclusion related to the world, it's a risk of inflation. In the short term, everything indicates that the world economy is in a position to absorb the current tsunamis of liquidity and to rescue the countries. But the output gap, the unemployment above its natural rate, and the heterogeneity in the recovery semi-closed service sector persist are one of the main characteristics of that tsunami. The medium and long-term rates rose in 2021 in the US, basically in response to a normalization of inflation that went from almost zero a year ago to 1.5 today. But neither interest rate nor inflation is high so far. Both of them remain below that historical low thresholds. Coming out of 2021, that I see as an inch year, the risk of waking up to higher inflation above manager levels, it's open. So far, that risk seems distant, but the challenge to normalize the global macro without creating bubbles or deviation or delays, it's over. That's my first part of my presentation. Secondly, the regional triangle. Until the 2020, as we saw in our last presentation, until the 2020, the pandemic, the region enjoyed consolidated macro fundamentals, improved a lot, but without transmission to the growth area, without results. So, in other words, the result of that was a low growth. So, a growth crisis. In general, it faced that the 2008-2009 international crisis with consolidated macro improvement fundamentals, so produced to suffer a little and get out of that crisis quickly. In 2010, 2011, the region improved again and growth again, but since 2011, the macro growth results have been mediocre and unequal. That's the idea. Here appear a mix of elements playing the terms of trade, the world demand, domestically the stop of structural demand. There were also political changes in several countries with the difficulties and social unrest environment, as happened in Chile or in Ecuador. The pre-pandemic figures show us that the macro decline and with a very unequal result until 2011, the region coupled to the global macro trend with the high growth. But between, you can see 2012, 2015, the global tailwind began to change and the region starting to slow down. And since 2017, the standstill practically has been widespread. That's my view related that what happened with the region until the pandemic. So I mean that the improvement of the macro fundamentals, checking the low inflation, low unemployment, high level of international reserves, the fiscal deficit, the country risk, and the positive trade balance, except for Brazil and Argentina. When we see, following the same analysis that the international view, the regional triangle, we see very complicated on its three sides, in its 3 points. From the sanitary point of view, waiting for the third wave, and with the new strains coming from Brazil, a very low of vaccination. From the political point of view, the revival of a regional left-wing bloc as a 2000 style. And from the economic point of view, adding problems to the stagnant region, putting on the favorable point, in the positive point, the favorable prices of raw materials. From the beginning, by the sanitary point of view, the region did not have an homogeneous approach dealing with the pandemic. We can see extreme responses, such was the case of Argentina and Brazil, one of them strictly quarantine and the other one nothing. Intermediate responses, as happened with Chile and Mexico. Never was a correlation between the type of crisis management and the amount of infections or deaths. In the case of Mexico, applied the light restrictions and with the lower infections. Argentina applied the hardest quarantine with the highest level of infections per million of inhabitants, and the rest more or less the following. So looking ahead, seeing the remainder of 2021, the margins to once again to huge restriction, ample restriction, strong quarantines, restrict circulation in a general, prolonged and arbitrary way is null. Is null. Practically, the people don't accept to enter again in such kind of quarantines. At the moment, the only country that is making progress in immunizing the population is Chile, vaccinating 26% of the population with one dose. The rest are only covering a minimal part of the population, between 3 and 5%, with the very low chances that in the 2021 the region will be able to immunize a relevant percentage of their population. From the political side, the problem is that the risk to return to a left-wing leaderships has happened in the 2000, but this time without money or containment network. That was the idea. The pandemic and its social and economic consequences seem to open space for the rebirth of this regional left, and the emblematic case is Lula da Silva in Brazil, that could be an important player in this exercise. But Alberto Fernandez, before the pandemic too, in Argentina, and in Ecuador, President Arauz as a favorite candidate to win the election, and President Arce as the new president in Bolivia. So Latin American politics is entering in bad news for the economic scenario of the coming years. Following the same kind of analysis for the rest of the world, from the economic side, the strong recession over a very poor growth trend. So in this case, the level of a GDP would remain at the 9% in comparison to where it was expected to be before the shock. That's more idea, the consequence of the crisis, and simultaneously the opportunity for the region. So I told you that we enjoy a point in favor of the crisis. The price of the raw materials wake up, soybean, corn, grades on the grains area, and oil, copper, and gold on the other ones. This issue will help reduce vulnerabilities and boost some sectors, but it did not solve imbalances or improve the growth. Finally, we can check we can use a 5 to 10 minutes by countries: Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. Brazil is complicated on its three sides. From the sanitary point of view, the contagions, infections, and lethality non-stop. So the new strain appeared without vaccines. From the political point of view, as I told you, Bolsonaro reforms were halfway. The government appears the value, and Lula da Silva factor appears as a main issue in the opposition. And curiously, on the economic side, it was one of the less affected economy in 2020, but it was almost stagnant before the pandemic. It will be difficult to recover and to return to the root. That's the idea. From the sanitary point of view, the situation is currently the worst in the world and faces a menace for the rest of the region, considering the new strain that coming from one of the states of Brazil. From the political side, during the first year, Jair Bolsonaro appears as a reformist president. For example, it achieved the social security reform, but due to the pandemic, other important issues aligned with such kind of reform become stagnant. For example, to put some, Manaus was the state of the Brazil where appeared the new strain. example to set the maximum public spending, or the possible benefit to attract the new money through a different kind of privatizations and so on. Finally, the probability that Lula da Silva run for office in 2022 again stresses even more the Brazilian political impact. The economic side shows us the small impact of the sanitary crisis over the economic activity. That was a surprise, only 4.1% during 2020, as a different to another countries. But currently, Brazil has two macro restrictions on what to support a moderate growth. First, a delicate fiscal picture. We can see that the Brazilians spend a lot of money as a fiscal reserve trying to moderate the impact of the pandemic. And the inflation left the 3.4% area, and it quickly moved to the 5 to 6% area and triggered an early answer to the central bank. The central bank of the Brazilian central bank decided to defend credibility and increased the interest rates rather than stimulating the demand recovery. That's one of the main consequences of Brazil. The conclusion in the short term Brazil agenda is the health crisis. So Jair Bolsonaro, president, appears as the value. It needs to return to the original reform, its root. Brazil has a macro margin to avoid of financial disruption or reliefs on the level of activity, but runs a great risk of defrauding growth and inflation again. It's no margin to the central bank and the treasury to underpin a recovery. So the question which remain is what path will Lula da Silva recent release take in terms of being able to lead a left alliance again and to return to the power. So as happened in my presentation, I leave you the appendix: GDP, inflation, trade balance, export, imports, current account, international reserves, interest rate, unemployment rate, revenues, public spending, fiscal primary result, interest rates, financial result, public debt, real FX market, and country's risk of each country, in this case, Brazil. Secondly, Mexico. Mexico apparently looks manageable in the sanitary and the political side. The challenge is the economic side. The sanitary, it's under control in comparison to other countries, looks with a reasonable perspective in terms of vaccines availability. And curiously, from the political point of view, there is a strong official leadership. So with uncertainty due to the populist course before the pandemic, that was the idea. And finally, on the economy, the Mexicans suffered a strong recession with small monetary and fiscal stimulus, and it's depending basically to the new exports to USA. That's the idea. The sanitary side looks partially controlled after the second wave in January 2021. According to the daily reports, the sanitary situation is improving, and considering the short distance and the relationship with the USA, maybe it might arrive in the short terms. The reference is the vaccines. So from the political point of view, keeps a leadership with ideological bias. But AMLO, the president, presents himself as the only Latin American president with a strong leadership. In other words, the pandemic did not damage his image. It's a curious thing. It is possible that the legislative election, the congressional election, the midterm election this year, results in a better representation in the Chamber of Deputies. So AMLO received critics from a businessman due to his populist initiatives. So, example, the reform of energy system, the downgrading importance to the private sector, but at the same time, it strengthened in the alliance with the USA, beginning with the former president Donald Trump, and currently too. So Joe Biden's was the first international political actions that was to get together with AMLO and Justin Trudeau. So as an example of the friendly situation with the Americans. And the economic side is the worst side of the crisis. Practically, it had one of the worst performance in the region, even though they did not restrict circulation in their activities, but also it did not apply any fiscal and monetary stimulus, such happened in Brazil, and we will see later in Argentina. The stimulus to the economy was skinny, which avoided the disruption of the variables, but and the country risk looks as with a good credit perception that the Mexicans try to be on track with the fiscal results, or in other words, it's better to say that losing few money to amplify the fiscal deficit and even the public debt. Same as the monetary policy, neither applies an aggressive monetary policy so as to give an extra stimulus to the economy. In other words, the Central Bank of Mexico is committed to avoid an FX depreciation, which causes inflation to increase rather than giving a stimulus to a local demand. My conclusion related to Mexico, sanitarily, the administration is avoiding a strong new outbreak, and maybe a more dynamic vaccination process can begin if it receives from USA aid with the supply of vaccines. The GDP comes from a strong fall in 2020 that gives room for a strong rebound, and the central bank can keep an expansionary bias and no changes in increasing the interest rate. There is room for counter-cyclical policy as a flip side of to save money in 2020 to stimulate the fiscal situation, and maybe it would probably benefit from acceleration in US growth. My appendix related to the key variables, and the last country, Argentina, beginning by the triangle. So it shows us the most complex in the region. So from the sanitary point of view, beginning with the strict lockdown and 2021 without roadmap, especially on the vaccination process. From the political point of view, beginning this process before the pandemic with the dual command, yes, with the strong vice president, so that it makes a decision-making and a management difficult during the crisis, putting high uncertainty on the table. And as happened currently in the last 70 years in Argentina, with the complex macroeconomic situation where the pandemic was is being financed through a monetary printing money. From the sanitary side is blindly with the vaccination process, crossing the fingers. And even though the number of cases fell, winter is coming and has happened in the North Hemisphere. Maybe we will suffer the second wave, and the vaccination campaign is too slow. Because of that, the menace of second wave is over there. From the political case side, as I told you, but presented as a structural fact, structural problem, the double command that went wrong. The president never achieved a strong leadership and does not seem to control the official party. Related to the vice president, the her judicial problems concern were not solved, and the president's explanations about the pardon or amnesty shows his lack of involvement to solve that. it's a problem. And the ruling party will put everything in the game considering the midterm election. So we will face during 2021 and a midterm election, important midterm election that is playing a role as an inch because to consolidate or not the ruling party in the administration. From the political and economical point of view, the ruling party politicians challenge in next 7 months from April to the end of October, date of the midterm election, taking the economy to follow political priorities. That's the issue. So playing an important role from the sanitary point of view, the vaccines appearance and availability. So from the economic point of view, during 2020, so Argentina faced the pandemic printing money. The consequences was an FX gap within between the official market and the parallel market of 100%, with the 36% as a rate of inflation, beginning from 43 and 53 during 2018 and 2019 respectively, and losing reserves to support the private FX demand and the public debt payments to the multilateral organization. So far, there are no spaces left for issuance of currency without accelerating the rate of inflation or a new available reserves to sell. In other words, I'm trying to tell you that for 2021 situation, the central bank and the treasury interest payment need to be rescheduled in the domestic market, and maybe the consequences will be that more than 40%, even though the official desire is to repress the rate of inflation, delaying FX crawling peg, price control, frozen tariffs, but notwithstanding that, maybe we will continue under the 40-45% area as a rate of inflation. And the dollar side, the trade surplus maybe might balance the demand due to the international prices boom and import restrictions, and on the public debt repayments. So Argentina needs to face $10 billion with international organisms. They must gain access to loans with the same organism so as not to breach the upcoming payments. So definitely my risk in the short term is the inflation acceleration. You have over there the total amount of the debt payments for the multilateral organization during 2021, $10 billion. Argentina is trying to negotiate $5 billion with the IMF from the total amount of debt for the $45 billion. And next May, the rescheduling with the Paris Club for around almost $3 billion. That's the idea. The economic minister requested to the IMF an extended fund facility to reschedule the debt, a new package at the bottom, but the government's political wing is unwilling with that, is asking for 20 years. That doesn't exist. So one possibility would be to sign a short bridging and light agreement as happened during 2003 and until 2005 with the former president Dualde and Kirchner. But another one, maybe the most probability way, it's and the official hope, and the IMF too, would be that the IMF authorize a worldwide placement, issuance of new SDRs for the pandemic from Caribbean and African countries, but Argentina will take the advantage to take as a partner of part of the new allocation to repayments. In other words, it's trying to solve the problem at least for 2021. So related to the rate of inflation, Argentina finished the year at 36% as a rate of inflation. Keep in mind that during 2018 was 43. During the last year of former President Macri was 53, and the last was only between quotes 36, but in our calculation between 10 to 12% repressing inflation. And currently, maybe Argentina will face the new midterm election September, October, last 12 months from 40 to 45% as a GDP, as a accumulated base 12 months as a rate of inflation. So in other words, Argentina is completing a cycle of 4 years in a row for a rate of inflation of more than 40%. We are expecting around 6 to 7% as an economic rebound. In favor is the statistical drag of 5 points that leaves 2020, and maybe a slight additional increase that would show the first quarter of 2021. The challenges, again, the rate of inflation, wages, lack of imports, due to the problems in the FX market and political uncertainty. That's my appendix related to Argentina, and my conclusion of Argentina. It's the increasing of the rate of inflation made by the government improvise a new economic plan on the go. The sanitary picture is the coming winter and the inflation rate in the following months will determine the midterm election. 2021 means that the ruling party prepared a 7-month year program until the midterm election next October, and November, December is a long-term concern. It's the second part of the ruling party and administration issues. So it's forcing to have a 29% as inflation rate. It's anesthetizing the official FX market and the official FX cap, and it's praying for international corn prices and new SDR allocation, trying to reschedule the debt with the IMF. Well, thank you, all of you again. Thank you very much for being connected, and thank you again too for the Summit of Americans or organizers and a new invitation for me in this new virtual experience. Thank you very much.